We're going to hit a couple of the more challenging questions, and then we'll hit some of the questions that have been submitted, and then we'll open the floor for a Slavic free-for-all, where you guys get to ask your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. A couple of the questions that I was asked to address were, one, how could God command the killing of the Canaanites? That could take all evening. Well, there's been a long evening already, but that could be a big chunk. Also, the question of homosexuality and gay marriage, another big chunk. So I'll try to hit some of the bullet points. You may want to take notes. You may want to pick up the book When God Goes to Starbucks. I hit on some of those things there. And also I have some material at my website, paulcopan.com, that you can also look up, but I'll try to hit some of the high points on both of these big questions. Take some of the smaller questions that you have submitted. I mean, some of them are weighty, like the problem of evil. But I'm going to give a little bit more time to these questions, and then we'll want to give the floor to you all for some of your lingering questions, maybe even through some of the things that I've said up to this point. Feel free to come and offer a response, and we can engage on those issues. Let me say a few things about the question of the Canaanites. When you read in Deuteronomy 20, where God says, leave alive nothing that breathes, when you see that Joshua is going through all of these cities in the land of Canaan, and Joshua was saying that we left no survivors. There was no one left alive that breathed, and so forth. Well, how are we to make sense of this? Is it possible that God commanded this? Well, some people might say, and I think there's a point to this, just as God brought destruction at the flood of Noah, remember what preceded it, God having a very heavy heart, and God bringing judgment with a very heavy heart, that God was grieved. And so when God brings judgment, it is with a heavy heart, whether it be regarding the Canaanites or, it says even in Lamentations, when God brought judgment on the people of Judah, it says that God does not punish willingly. This is not something that God delights to do. This is something that God does with a heavy heart. And so when we look at these commands about the Canaanites, about judgment on people, by the way, who were engaged in bestiality, in homosexuality, in temple prostitution, in incest and so forth, it was no moral picnic in the land of Canaan. And so God, remember in Genesis 15:16, God told Abraham that he's going to wait until the sin of the Amorites, or the Canaanite peoples, was filled up. So that would mean well over 400 years before God would bring judgment on the Canaanites. So God is waiting patiently. The time is not ripe for judgment. Now, when Joshua goes in to these cities, it's very interesting when you read, on the one hand, Joshua will say, we left alive nothing that breathed. But then you find out that a few chapters later, those people are around, and there are plenty of them. For example, in chapter 11, the sons of Anak, or the Anakites, they were destroyed. And then we read in chapter 14, Caleb saying, there are a lot of Anakites left in the land. Well, which was it? Well, it's interesting. You read in Judges 1 and 2. It says there are lots of Canaanites still in the land. They're still entrenched in the land. So this is right after, in fact, overlapping with the book of Joshua. Judges 1 and 2 talks about the Canaanites couldn't be driven out. Well, what's happening here? Well, it is interesting in war texts. That's right. In war texts, like in the Middle East or in the ancient Near East, someone could win a narrow victory, and he would write, We totally annihilated them. We left alive nothing that breathed. It was part of the exaggeration motif in the ancient Near East that Joshua also utilized. It's very interesting. Moses says in Deuteronomy 20, leave alive nothing that breathes. Joshua says, we left alive nothing that breathed. And it says that Joshua did all that Moses commanded. We read that several times, for example, in chapter 11 of Joshua. But how is it then that you've got all these survivors within the same book? In fact, at the end of Joshua, in chapter 23, Joshua is saying, even though there were no survivors, Joshua at the end of the book says, there's still a lot of work to do, folks. There are a lot of nations that are still left among you. Well, what's going on here? Well, again, it's part of that exaggeration. And people who would read this in the ancient Near East knew that there was a lot of exaggeration. In fact, the language that's used a more predominant language is used of driving out or dispossessing the Canaanites. It talks about not being able to drive them out. So routinely, God says, drive out these nations. Well, if you're driving out these nations or dispossessing the nations, you're not killing them. So here they're supposed to drive them out. Joshua, the language used in Joshua of driving them out is the same language that's used when Adam and Eve were driven out of the Garden of Eden, or David being driven out from the presence of Saul. They were driven out but not killed. Now, if Joshua did all that Moses commanded, but yet there are lots of survivors, well, maybe the language of Moses in Deuteronomy 20 presupposes that there is hyperbole or exaggeration going on. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, God said that what he would do to what he was going to do to the Canaanites was what he would do to the Israelites if they carried on those practices that the Canaanites did. And it's very interesting. That term, utterly destroy, is used in Jeremiah 25:9, where God says he is going to utterly destroy Judah, the southern kingdom, and leave their cities in everlasting desolation. Well, it didn't literally happen. You read the end of the book, and that's certainly not what happened. So you have that kind of language that is used both of the Canaanites as well as of the people of Judah. And so there is that sense of exaggeration. It's interesting, the language of utterly destroy is used of the Midianites in Numbers 31, where it says there were no males left alive. They were utterly destroyed. Well, then you get to Judges chapter 6, verse 5. And it says that the Midianites, I thought they were all gone, but no, they are back. The Midianite army is back in full force, too numerous to count, including all their camels. What's happening? Well, it's that sort of exaggeration that seems to be taking place here. We read in, again, the same language that's used of the Amalekites. So we've got the Canaanites, the Midianites, and the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15, where Saul is supposed to wipe out all the Amalekites, who were, again, they were a nasty bunch. They were on Israel's tail from the very beginning, from the time that they crossed over the Red Sea. And so there is this judgment that God is announcing upon them, because they're more like the Nazis. They're not like just some nomadic tribe wandering around and not looking for trouble. No, they were on the warpath. But something that is interesting here is it looks like in chapter 15 when Saul disobeys, he leaves a lot of animals around and doesn't kill King Agag, the king, he ends up, Samuel comes along, chastises Saul, ends up killing King Agag of the Amalekites. And you think, well, I guess that's all there is to the Amalekites. He was the last one, and Saul disobeyed. Well, then you read at the end of the book, and David is fighting a big Amalekite army again. Where did they all come from? So you're left wondering what's going on. So, for example, David fights against them, and 400 Amalekites escape. So we have this kind of a tension where, they're utterly destroyed, and yet they're still going on. So I just put this out there as a reminder that there are some tensions and questions that are involved here, that it's not as straightforward as it looks. Even the cities where Jericho, like Jericho and Ai and so forth, these are cities that don't have civilians living there. These are more like military citadels where you've got soldiers and maybe religious or political personnel there. But the other people are in the hill country. These are the first lines of defense. And so that's also another layer that I think is very interesting. God seems more interested in having the people dispossessed, removed from the land. Why? Because when think of a triangle. The people who are living in the land have a deity, and so you've got the deity, people, land triangle. And if you push people out of the land, this is a mark of the God, Yahweh's or the Lord's superiority over those deities. So it's a way to, in a sense, destabilize the religion. So this is the sort of thing that God is doing, engaging in spiritual warfare by helping the people to push out these Canaanites. But of course, there's a lot of compromise, and the people ultimately did not do that sort of a thing. But anyway, that's kind of a brief sketch of that scenario. I go into a lot more detail in the book, Is God a Moral Monster? And then there's another book that I just co-edited called Holy War in the Bible, and have a co-authored chapter in there, so you may want to look that up. Let me just move on now that we've totally taken care of that topic. No, I'm kidding. There's a lot more that we could say, but maybe just some things for you to think about. But let me go on to talk about the topic of homosexuality and gay marriage. It's a topic that requires delicacy. It requires compassion. A lot of times Christians in our churches are usually the last place that people who are struggling with same-sex attraction would want to go. Youth groups making jokes about being gay or whatever. I mean, a person who is struggling with same-sex attraction and really wants to follow the Lord, do you think he's going to confide in people in this youth group who are joking about being gay and so forth? No way. And people who are pastors need to set the proper tone for how this ought to be addressed. Churches ought to be the safest place for people who are struggling with same-sex attraction to come. But they're often the last place that people want to go because of the hostility, the animosity, the fear, the shame that goes along with that. And churches need to be proactive about creating a kind of community where people can come and talk about their struggles. If you want to read a very good book on this topic, it's by Chad Thompson, called Loving Homosexuals as Jesus Would. Very good book. And Chad Thompson, you can look at his website. He's a former homosexual. He has a website called inquiry.com. And again, just writing very sympathetically because he has come out of this struggle. And so he is very concerned about how Christians treat those who are struggling with same-sex attraction. Now, I'm not going to go into the biblical evidence for it except to say that there are various passages that talk about it Paul uses language from Leviticus chapter 19, or Leviticus 18, in Romans chapter 1, about people who, and also 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where he talks about the active and passive partners in a gay, homosexual relationship. And in the Roman times, in Paul's day, it was okay to be the active partner, but not the passive one. That was the shameful thing. But Paul here is saying no to both. And he's using the language from the Greek Old Testament, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, using the same words from Leviticus chapter 18. Also, we see the same sort of issues in Genesis 19, think of the 19s. Genesis 19 and Judges 19, you have Sodom with Lot and the people who want to rape these men who have come into the town. And then you have the same sort of scenario where there are these wicked men who want to take this guest who has come into this town in Gibeah. And of course, they do something, the man lets his wife go out, and they rape her throughout the night, and she ends up dying at the end. Again, so there's similar stories of attempted homosexual rape. So again, this is seen as detestable and wicked and so forth. And so in my book, When God Goes to Starbucks, I go into some detail on that. But let me offer a few comments on the issue of, are people born gay or not? There are two wrong extremes that we ought to avoid. One is that people are born gay, and on the other extreme, that homosexuality or same-sex attraction is a choice. Now, homosexual acts are a choice. You act on them, just as heterosexual sexual acts are a choice. But people are not, they do not choose to whom they are attracted. There are people who have grown up with same-sex desires, and they have not wanted those. If anything, they would want to be, have heterosexual desires because it has just brought so much affliction to their lives, a lot of hostility toward them. A lot of people who, on the other side, who are practicing homosexuals, and they'll say that they were born this way. Well, they're usually not willing to explore the nurturing side of things. They only say that, oh, it's just biological, it's genetic. That's, there's the gay gene somewhere, and we're going to discover it. It's interesting that people don't want to explore, in the gay community, they don't want to explore that maybe there are some things that have gone wrong in childhood. Maybe there are some patterns that ought to be explored. In fact, there's a woman by the name of Elizabeth Moberly who has worked for an organization, and she has engaged with people who have, and counseled with them, who have struggled with same-sex attraction. And she said a typical scenario is this, where you have men who, as little boys, they grow up. The first couple of years they're attached to their mothers. Then they become attached to their fathers for the next couple of years. And then once they kind of move out into public life, say once they enter into school after the age of 5, then they seek to connect with their same-sex peers in a non-sexual way. This is where the problem comes. Say for a young man who doesn't have a loving, affectionate, caring, present father, there is not that male bonding that takes place. So he looks for it then in his same-sex peers, and if he is rejected by them, if there is not that connection, when you're playing soccer and you score a goal and guys will hug you and so forth, it's physical touch in a non-sexual way. Well, when someone grows up and he doesn't have the affirmation of a father, maybe he likes reading books, the arts, music, and so forth, and then he's called sissy or whatever. He starts to internalize those criticisms, has failed to make that kind of connection, and then when he hits puberty, he tries to connect with his own sex, but it turns out to be in a sexual way. It's interesting that Chad Thompson, in his book, Loving Homosexuals as Jesus Would, talks about how he could not imagine guys in their late teens or 20s hugging each other in a non-sexual way, because for him, that's all you did as someone who was attracted to someone of the same sex. You would, that's why you would hug them, because you were sexually interested. But he said he saw these guys watching TV, a football game, and they were hugging each other, patting each other on the back, and he said it was totally non-sexual, and it just baffled him. And he said, one thing that brought him healing, because he didn't have a good relationship with his father, with same-sex peers growing up, it was when guys, would give him a hug that was a little bit longer than usual, when they would put a hand on the shoulder and keep it there, and it was clearly not sexual, that this started to bring healing to him, that he started to relate to guys not as people he could be sexually interested in, but as friends in a non-sexual way. And he said that this brought remarkable healing to him. And so I've had people come to my office at Palm Beach Atlantic University who've struggled with same-sex attraction. And some people get really nervous or fearful. Just remember, these are folks who have had a lot of struggles. They have had something go wrong in their childhood. And So when they come in and I'll just listen to them, I'll pray for them, I'll put my hand on a shoulder, just praying for that person the whole time. No, guy. Just to reinforce that point. And so I'm trying to help, in a sense, compensate for some of that lost affection that was not there in his growing up years in a non-sexual way. For women, it's a little more complicated. Women, you are a little more complicated than guys are. We're just dumb guys. And when it comes to the growing up years of, girls before they turn into women, this woman, Elizabeth Moberly, who, she said the same thing, where there's a detachment on the male part with the same-sex parent. With the female, it's the same way, that there's often a detachment in some way. Something that compounds things, however, is when there are unsafe males in the life of girls growing up. So if there has been sexual molestation, if there's been a violent male in the home, then the girl concludes that the only safe people are women. The only safe people to get, the only people to get intimate with would be women and not men. And so this is how it often works in that direction. Now, I'm not saying that genetics is totally irrelevant, because sometimes a person can be born, like a guy can be born with a temperament that is just more artistic. His body may be, not as, athletic. And so this can, in this growing up process, lead to a lot of teasing, a lot of kidding, a lot of harassment. And so this, I tell you, all the people I know, and there's a guy who went to the summer camp here, and he, absent father, he kind of internalized something. His mother was the only person in his life, and so he kind of internalized some of those kind of things that we typically associate with being feminine and so forth, at a very feminine manner and so on. And he ended up going into the gay lifestyle. Somebody who came to this camp when I was a kid. And, all of the people that I've known, and as I talk to people who are talking about, I've got a friend who is gay, and I'll say, well, tell me about him. And it often fits this very pattern. But again, I'm saying that genetics can contribute, but that's not the complete explanation at all. That's only a partial one. And of course, people ultimately make choices about these things. Let me mention something else that is important. That as people, sometimes in college, women, because they're seeking intimacy, maybe they haven't had a strong family tie strong family ties growing up, and they're looking for intimacy. Sometimes they're in college dorm room and they just get intimate with their roommates and so forth. And this can actually, it may just be for college years. Some people, that just happens to be just that time of intimacy, and then they go on and get married to a guy, and that's that. But there could also be a certain rewiring of the brain that takes place through repeated behavior. And so even if a person may not be attracted to the same sex, but maybe finds intimacy with someone of the same sex in one of these intimate scenarios, and then it just keeps on growing, well, that soon becomes part of the person's psyche. As I said before, you can rewire your brain by the choices that you make, by patterns that you establish. London taxi drivers, for example, they have to take a test to know all the 25,000 streets of London. They have to know when they're one-way, when they're two-way. And so they take this massive test that is required of all London taxi drivers. And you know what? Their brains in a certain part are more enlarged than the rest of the London population. Why? Because they have had to work on memorizing, learning, and so forth. And this actually has physical effects, which is a very good argument for the existence of the soul or the self that exists, that the soul is more than just the brain, because there is a self that can make decisions and choices that can actually rewire the brain to establish new patterns. And this is also something that is very valuable for us to know as we seek to establish spiritual disciplines in our lives, where we grow in these disciplines of fasting, of prayer, of worship, of celebration, of abstinence, of silence in various ways. These are the sorts of things that we start to develop our brains as a result of the choices that we make, so that obedience becomes second nature for us. So Paul said, discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness, he told Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 4. Discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness, so that obedience, the implication is, will become second nature to you. So, just want to make a few comments there on the issue of same-sex attraction. If you want to take a look, there's a 19-minute video a colleague of mine at Palm Beach Atlantic University put together, Julie Hamilton, who is called homosexuality101.com. So you can look up this website and get some information. There's a 19-minute video that gives a presentation on this topic of same-sex attraction and so on. And there are lots of other resources that will be very helpful for you. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. What about the topic of gay marriage? To say, well, the Bible says that homosexuality is wrong, homosexual acts are wrong. By the way, the Bible doesn't speak about people who have a homosexual orientation. It just talks about homosexual acts. And so the Bible is not saying you're condemned because you have same-sex attraction, something that you could not help. This is just a childhood sort of thing that has been, in a sense, imposed upon you. But of course, you need to kind of work out those sorts of things. But it's not the desire that has been cultivated in a person through dysfunctional relationships that Scripture speaks against, but actually the acts themselves. I should add this too. There are people who actually come out of gay relationships. They end up being attracted to people of the opposite sex, end up getting married, having children, and so forth. So genetics they are not destiny. People can come out of these relationships. There's a woman in my church. Her name's Diane Falzerano. Her husband, Anthony Falzerano, who died last year, he had been very much involved in a gay lifestyle in New York City, had been together with some prominent guys, and in fact, he writes about it. I think his name is Arthur Cohen, who had been the lawyer for McCarthy, the senator during the McCarthy era, and so he had been together with him sexually. And he writes about this in a book called "Such Were Some of You," and of course taken from Paul's letter in 1 Corinthians, where Paul talks about homosexuals, the effeminate homosexuals, the passive and active partners in the gay relationship. He says, "Such were some of you, but you are washed, you are sanctified, you are justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ." And so he is saying that you practice these things, but you came out of that. And so my friend, Anthony Falzerano had come out of this, had ended up getting married, has two children, one of whom attends our church in Florida. And again, if you want to read another book about somebody who's come through this, it's called "Such Were Some of You," published by Xylon Press. But again, and he writes in this book that people who come out of homosexuality or the gay lifestyle are the strongest argument against the gay lobby. Because for the gay lobby, they say, no, you are this way for the rest of your life. You cannot change. It's destiny. Well, people who come out of this, who've actually been changed, they say, no, it's not destiny. And it's unfair for you to just say you can't change, because people actually do change. Some more than others, but still change is possible. For example, some people say, take smoking, for example. People quit, they break the habit, they stop smoking. That is a significant step. Somebody might say, well, you still have those cravings. Well, maybe so, but it's a big step to actually stop smoking. And then to finally see those cravings start to diminish over time. Yeah, those cravings may still be there, but that doesn't mean that I'm somehow, a smoker by design or by genetics or something like that. So the same thing goes with homosexuality and homosexual acts. What about gay marriage? Well, again, to say that the Bible says homosexuality is wrong, it's a deviation from God's created order, is not going to be an adequate argument when you're talking to people in public discussion. How do we make the public case for traditional marriage? I'll tell you after I take the sip. Well, what we ought to do is, first of all, try to get a definition of marriage under our belts. Marriage, as has been traditionally understood over the millennia, across the civilizations, again, this is not a religious definition, but it is one that has stood the test of time, that has been assumed by people that marriage is a one flesh union, sexual union, that is the result of a permanent commitment made by a man and a woman that is directed toward the conceiving and raising of children. So it's this one flesh union between a man and a woman that is a result of a personal, as a permanent commitment that they make to each other that is directed toward the conceiving and bearing of children. Now, is it possible to have a marriage that does not have children? Yes. But it's interesting that the sorts of things that people do as homosexuals would not be, have not been traditionally seen as consummating a marriage between a man and a woman. That just, again, consummation is, you have a naked man and a naked woman. There's a fit here by nature, by God's design. That is not part of the picture when you have two men or two women. And so notice the complementarity too, that when you bring a man and a woman together, a child can come as a result, where you don't have that with two men or two women. There is a dependence relationship here. You need both of them to bring forth children. And so this is a natural starting point for a family. Now, people who argue for gay marriage, saying we have a right to gay marriage, are typically ones who say that society constructs the definitions of marriage. And so they don't want to give you a definition of what marriage is. They simply say that marriage does not exclude gay couples or lesbian couples. So they don't want to define marriage. They only say that it doesn't exclude gay couples. Now, the problem with this view, if marriage is simply the construction of a society, if the definition is just made up by society, well, there is no essence to marriage then. There is nothing that really defines marriage as marriage if we're just making it up. But this is part of the problem when we're dealing with people who are advocating for gay marriage, saying they have a right to it, that they're being somehow unjustly treated if they cannot marry. Well, if there is some injustice that they have a right to marry, but they cannot, then they're no longer using this idea that marriage is just a construction of societies, that we just define it any way we want to. They're saying, no, marriage does actually have an essence after all, and that it is just and right to include gay couples in this definition of marriage. But again, the whole foundation for their argument collapses, because if we just make up definitions, why prefer one definition over against another? It's just totally arbitrary. So there are going to be no justice issues involved. We're just making stuff up. So you can't say one view is wrong and the other view is right, because societies just make it up. Muslims make up, their own rules about marriage. So why think that it would be wrong for them to define marriage in a certain way where the woman is not respected for having her own particular views, but is under the rule of her husband? that he can, according to the Quran, he can beat her. And if you read, there's a book that I read recently by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was called Infidel, growing up in Somalia, being put into this forced relationship with someone whom she did not want to marry, and just tells about her unfolding story. But it reveals a lot about what goes on in marriages in Islam. Even in Britain, there are lots of forced marriages. Well, should we say, well, that's just the way that they've constructed marriage, and that there is no injustice because that's just how they've defined it? Well, these are some of the important groundwork sorts of questions that we need to be asking. Now, again, some of this is theoretical, and you think, man, this is getting really, really philosophical for being so late at night. But let me now move into some of the more concrete points here to try to make the public case. The state cannot be neutral about these issues. The state has to take a stand one way or the other. When you say the state ought to take a stance, that is a moral position that is being advocated. The state cannot say, well, we'll just kind of stand back and... No, it's going to have to decide one way or the other, in favor of traditional marriage or not. And the state has an interest in a traditional marriage because, you know what? Marriages where there's a husband and a wife are the best condition, hands down, for bringing up children in a healthy way. It's interesting that when Barack Obama or Michelle Obama was talking about her husband at the Democratic National Convention, it's very interesting that she talked about how her girls needed their father. He's come out in favor of gay marriage, but isn't it interesting? These girls needed their father. Well, you know what? If you've got two moms, you're by definition excluding a father from being in that child's life. By all measures, all studies, mother and father are going to be the healthiest way to bring up children. It's not a guarantee, but this is going to be the healthiest context by all measures in terms of psychological health and so forth. You can read about Maggie Gallagher writing about the case for marriage. Recently, Mark Regnerus at the University of Texas at Austin did a study on the claim that children who grow up in gay or lesbian homes are just as well adjusted as anybody else. That is wrong. He really went to great lengths to show how that is not the case, how they really thrive in homes where there's a father and a mother. Children need a father. Children need a mother. Some people say, well, in fact, it's kind of interesting. I was teaching a Sunday school class probably about half a year ago, and they asked me to do something on gay marriage, and I thought I was going to be preaching to the choir. Well, in the Sunday school class, this new person walks in. She's a lawyer from San Francisco, wants to check out our church. And so I start talking, and I can tell that she's getting really uncomfortable. I'm saying these sorts of things. And she said, raised her hand and said, I'm starting to feel very uncomfortable about this. And I said, oh, really? She said, yeah. She said, I know a lot of gay couples, and if it weren't for those gay parents, the children would fall through the cracks. And I said, well, I'm sure there are many loving people who are gay or lesbian. I would agree. I know people who are loving gays or lesbians. But I said, but the issue here is, what is the state's best interest for family structure? I said, single parents. If it weren't for single parents, there are a lot of kids would fall through the cracks, but no one would be advocating that having just a single parent would be just as good an arrangement for a family as a two-parent home. So I said, and when children have mother and father, which means to often intact families, when they have a mother and a father, in terms of welfare payments, in terms of cost to the state, it goes way down. So there are a lot of problems that come when you don't have mother and father in the home, and the state has to pay the bill. So the state has a very strong interest in what kind of family, or should have a strong interest in what family arrangements work best in society and help to actually sustain society that are in the best interests of the long-term, the long-term benefits of society. Those are some things that we could also be talking about. I could go into more detail here, but I could, and I could add more of these sorts of things. But let me just make a couple of final statements on this, and then we'll get into some of your questions. If there is an arrangement where we say, the state can make up whatever definition it wants, well, then we could also start saying, well, what about other arrangements besides gays and lesbians? For example, there was a Columbia University professor, David Epstein, who we found out he was put on trial for having sexual relations with his own daughter, but she was of legal age. She was 21 when she began to have sexual relations with her own father for over 3 years. Now, what would be the problem with legalizing this and saying that this is another one of those legitimate definitions of marriage? We could just include that as part of the definition. I remember listening to a radio talk show where there is a woman who said, I should have a right to marry my pet dog. I kid you not. There's Avery Dulles. I think it's Avery Dulles, a Catholic thinker, tells a story about someone he knew who was he knew the town clerk in Colorado, or knows the story of this. A man goes to the town clerk in a small town in Colorado with a horse. And guess what he wants to do? He wants to get a marriage license for him and the horse. Well, there's nothing on the books for this sort of a thing, and the best the town clerk could do, she declined the marriage license because the horse was under 18 years of age. Now, all I'm trying to do here is highlight, in a sense, the logic of this sort of a thing. Why not have group marriages? What about 10 people in a marriage? Why couldn't they all be part of this new marital arrangement? Or maybe some people who protest numberism say, I'm just going to identify myself as being married to my own self, and I should have all sorts of tax benefits that come with that. There are, what about polygamy? Why not let the Mormons have their way? Why not have multiple wives? You see, once you say that we can make up whatever definition of marriage we want, where does it all end? These are the sorts of things that we ought to be considering rather than just rushing headlong into marriage. And in fact, it's very interesting that a lot of people who are pressing for gay marriage are not at all interested in bringing up children. They want the legal status, they want the benefits that come with it. And what often happens is that children end up losing in all of this. Because, frankly, gays, less so lesbians, but gays are much more permissive in their own sexual relations, much more promiscuous. Sometimes they will have hundreds or even over 1,000 partners in their lifetimes. The average number is just shocking. And you can just easily find these statistics online. But multiple partners is not going to be good for stable homes to raise children. It's going to create all sorts of confusion, identity problems, and so forth. This is not the sort of thing you bring children into. So these are some public reasons that we're giving, not appealing to the Bible, but giving public reasons for why gay marriage is not a good idea and why traditional marriage makes better sense. All right, I'm going to stop there. I've been on a roll, It's after 11 o'clock. So let's take some of these smaller questions. Should we take some questions on what I've just said maybe first? Just to kind of wrap these things up. Yeah.
Well, I have two questions. The first one is about what you talked about the Canaanites. Is it possible, in your opinion and in your estimate, is it possible that God truly did command Joshua to go in and clean house? That was a literal command of God. Is that compatible with morality? Is God just in doing that? Is that possible?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. Remember, the question is it compatible with, morality for God to do this sort of a thing, to command the Canaanites to be utterly destroyed? Well, a couple of things. Do keep in mind, I do mention this because there are some tensions that are created when God says utterly destroy, but also says, a little loud here, but also says that you are to drive them out. So there is that tension. If you're driving them out, then you're not killing them. So there is that sort of a tension. And what it could simply be is that when God is commanding them, it could simply be that God is, that the attacks on these particular cities where you had these military personnel, these are more like, as one biblical scholar, Kenneth Kitchen, writes, he's an archaeologist, he says these are more like disabling raids on those cities. So the same thing happens to Jerusalem when it's destroyed by the Babylonians. God said he's going to utterly destroy them, but what ends up happening? Well, the political, religious, and economic systems are all disabled. It doesn't mean that all the people from Judah are utterly destroyed, literally. So God uses that very language of the people of Judah, but it doesn't have that same sort of literalness. Now, is it possible that God could do that? Well, God brought judgment on all the earth, what we read about in Genesis chapters 6 through 8 with the flood and so forth, that God was grieved that he had made human beings, that there was a sadness, a heavy-heartedness in bringing judgment. And so I don't rule that out. But I would say that these are the sorts of things that would be done in cases of supreme emergency. And again, we could bring up an issue, and we talk about it in the essay in Holy War in the Bible, that you think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, there are scholars on both sides that say, some say we should have dropped the bomb, others say we shouldn't have dropped the bomb on those cities. But it was a case of supreme emergency, and there are good arguments on both sides. And so to say, to bomb civilian populations should not have been done, well, actually, given the case of supreme emergency and the fact that the war could have gone on much longer and many hundreds of thousands, even millions more losing their lives because Japan refused to surrender, there could be a plausible case that is made here. So philosophers distinguish between prima facie duties, that is, all things being equal, and then you have kind of extraordinary circumstances where you may need to bring other considerations in, such as supreme emergency, in order to do this. So I would allow for it, but I'm saying I don't think that that's what's going on.
Okay, I agree with you. That's a good answer. Another question, back where you were talking about relativism. Is it possible for me to say that it's a possibility that there is no knowledge? I don't believe that. I'm asking, is that possible to believe that I could possibly believe that there is no truth? To believe that, not in an absolute way, to believe that's a possibility.
So your question is, could we not say that maybe knowledge is not possible? That might be, rather than saying, instead of saying that you can't have, that knowledge is impossible, which assumes that knowledge, it's making a knowledge claim.
My statement and create your own perfect grammatical structure, because I can't. You know what I'm saying, right? That's a possibility. He's confusing you.
I want to make sure that I'm getting this right, so let's try to get the grammar down as well. Are you simply asking the question, can we not simply rest with this, that perhaps knowledge is possible, but it may not be possible. Is it something like that? Would that work? Okay. Well, for one thing, it would be good to know what we mean by knowledge. Does knowledge mean having 100% certainty? And I think a lot of times people operate on that assumption. And so I want to know what you mean by knowledge in the first place. A lot of people will define knowledge as requiring 100% certainty, that if you don't have 100% certainty, you cannot have knowledge. Well, of course, I want to know what is the basis for that. How do you know with 100% certainty that knowledge requires 100% certainty? And secondly, so again, it ends up becoming a real problem. And so we know a lot of things that we don't have 100% certainty about, and that's okay. We'd have confident knowledge. For example, it's logically possible that I'm speaking to an illusory audience, that you are just all an illusion. Maybe I just haven't gotten enough sleep of late, and so I'm dreaming this, and so on. But I suspect very strongly that this is a wrong-headed idea, that there actually is a group in front of me to whom I'm speaking. And so I'd say we can know things with confidence, even if we don't have absolute certainty. And I would say that even when you say, well, maybe we can know, maybe we can't, I want to push a little bit on that and say, one, what do you mean by knowledge? Secondly, would you not be willing to acknowledge that we can know certain things that are much more likely than others to be the case? For example, I can know that, say something from National Geographic about maybe the, certain habitats or ecosystems and so forth, and there's a very good plausible case that is being made here, that I would be better justified in trusting National Geographic than I would, say, the National Enquirer about, some of these tabloids that talk about, aliens abduct, Hillary Clinton's dog or something like that. I think if we don't have knowledge at all, if knowledge is not possible, then we cannot at all distinguish between sane, very plausible scenarios and ones that are utterly ridiculous. And I think you wouldn't want to say that they're all basically the same, that there's really no basic difference between plausible, sane scenarios that are more likely true and ones that are just totally cracked. So I think that I would want to push you a little bit, rather than just leaving you there kind of in limbo. I'd say I don't think you really believe that. So I'd want to so anyway, that's where I would want to go with that. So can you theoretically say that? I suppose so, but I don't think your definition of knowledge. I'd want to know what you mean by knowledge and how you know that that's the definition of knowledge. And there, we're already dealing with a problem. Yeah, good. Yeah, excellent. Yes?
What is your kind of like understanding of civil unions and their place in
Okay.
same-sex marriage? And also, I think this goes along with the separation of church and state, and how far that needs to go and whether it needs to be existent at all.
Yeah. Okay, a couple of questions here. Let's talk about these unions, these legal unions, say for gay couples. And I would say there should be, in our society, we're not prosecuting gays as criminals or something like that. But I think there should be provision made for people, say inheritance rights or hospital visitation rights and so forth. I think there are some provisions that certainly could be made, and you don't have to make a case for gay marriage just to get inheritance rights or hospital visitation rights and so forth. So yeah, I think provisions could be made, but to change the definition of marriage is to utterly change the landscape of society. In fact, there are people who are getting sued because they disagree with gay marriage. They're getting let go of their jobs because they disagree with gay marriage. Can you imagine if it's legalized and nationalized, the kind of lawsuits that are going to come against people who are in these sorts of situations? So it's a big jump there. And to make it legal is going to lead to a number of ramifications for pastors, for churches, for Christian organizations. It's already making waves now. So those are some significant. So there are significant differences there. When it comes to the question of church and state separation, well, I think we have to be careful about how we cash that out. Do we mean, when we say church-state separation, that firemen who are to serve the public good can't put out fires of church buildings because there's a separation of church and state? No one takes that view. Or that the president, if there's an emergency, that he can't go to Mount Sinai Hospital or something like that, a religious hospital, because of the separation of church and state. The church and state separation was intended to, one, keep the state from basically suppressing religious freedom, and also to keep there from being some sort of a state-sponsored church. Those are the two things that the founding fathers were very committed to. And people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson sort of, but John Adams, they were very strong on the importance of the democracy and the American Constitution being for a religious people. They're very strong, saying that religion actually helps to support the well-being of society. Religion is necessary for the well-being of society. So they were not saying keep them away. No, they're saying that religion, all things being equal, I'm not talking about Islam here necessarily, although in some places it works better than others. But I would say when say the Christian faith is functioning properly, it's going to be producing good citizens. They're going to have a positive impact on neighborhoods and society in general. So they weren't saying they shouldn't have any sort of influence in the public sphere. Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Beautiful. I'm getting parched here, so this is just in the nick of time. So I would say, I think we need to ask what marriage arrangement is in the best interests of the common good. So we're not arguing for this is what the church is saying that it wants for itself, but it's saying, no, this is actually a public case can be made for, that this is for the public good. And so that's the kind of argument that I would make. So anyway, yeah. Okay, any other questions on these topics before we move on to some of the specific questions? Should go ahead. Or you got one here? All right.
Yeah, so one of the questions I was asked is, if Christianity is true, why are there so many hypocrites?
If Christianity is true, why are there so many hypocrites? Well, Jesus, for one, said that there would be lots of hypocrites, people who, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, Matthew chapter 7, didn't we do all these things in your name? Didn't we prophesy? Didn't we cast out demons? Didn't we do miracles in your name? Many will say to me, Jesus is saying. And then he'll say to them plainly, depart from me, I never knew you, you workers of lawlessness. So Jesus is saying people can play the religion game. The Pharisees did it. Jesus said, don't do what they do what they say. Yeah, they're speaking truth, but they're not living up to it. So Jesus was surrounded by it. He talked about it. He said, this is just going to happen. So you'll have hypocrisy wherever you go. And so it's not an argument against the Christian faith that there are lots of hypocrites, no more so than it's an argument for another position, because that'll have a lot of hypocrites too. So here it's not a matter of truth being proportional to how few hypocrites you have, but rather what we see is, and I think sometimes there is a cultural climate in which you live where, for example, if you're living as a Christian in a Muslim society, it's far less likely that you're going to be a hypocrite, where the name Christian means something very significant and very distinctive, as opposed to here in America where, yeah, I'm a Christian, yeah, and I'm living with my girlfriend and whatever. You can call yourself a Christian, but it doesn't really call you to make a stand on anything. So again, that can be part of the equation as well. Okay, another question.
Got another one over here. There are people who are naturally inclined to learning about apologetics. What would you suggest for people who are not? Should they push themselves to study it anyways? Is preaching the gospel sufficient?
Okay. All right, you heard that. What about people who aren't inclined to apologetics? Well, it's still good to have some basic arguments to engage with. It's good to use your mind to sharpen your thinking about these issues. And you know what? You're going to have kids who are asking you these questions. And so it's good for you to at least have some direction that you can give to your kids about these topics. It may mean saying, hey, let's explore this together, or here's a great website, or here's someone you can talk to. At least being able to refer people to some of these sources. This is important. But remember, there are people who struggle with issues. And remember, Holly Ordway gave that example. Was it this morning? Yeah. Somebody who believed that, no, actually it was yesterday's talk, where she believed that the Bible was just full of myths and fairy tales. And so when somebody would tell her about the gospel, it didn't really connect with her. Why? Because she thought that it was just another one of those fairy tales. But when someone can come along and say, it's more than fairy tales. I mean, when G.K. Chesterton talked about the gospel as being myth become fact. That is, all the best stories in fairy tales or epic legends, heroism, all of these grand tales of human accomplishment and so forth, they are ultimately realized in Jesus as being the fulfillment of all of these, the grandest of human aspirations, the best of human philosophy and so forth. Jesus is the one who encapsulates that. So that's what G.K. Chesterton talks about, myth becoming fact. And so we ought to remember that there are some people who will not take the gospel seriously until they see some of those misrepresentations cleared away. And then the gospel can be proclaimed. That's what the Apostle Paul is doing. He didn't just go in there and start quoting the Hebrew Scriptures in Acts 17 with the Athenians. He began where they were. He started quoting their poets and philosophers. He knew their language. He knew how to connect with them. And we need to be able to begin where people are. And then as we engage with them, to clear away some of those caricatures and misperceptions so they can see clearly who Jesus is. Let me give another example. How many of you are aware of the Da Vinci Code movie or book? Well, the Da Vinci Code led a lot of people astray. They'd say, yeah, the Da Vinci Code, the idea that Jesus is God, that was made up by Constantine in the 4th century. There are a lot of gospels that were excluded from the canon because people in power said that they were no good. No, that's not how it worked. But yet a lot of people are buying into this story that, the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, and it is, there's a lot of goofy stuff that's in there. It makes for fun reading, but fallacious. It's just wrong on a number of levels. But yet so many people being mistaken. And so some people say, I talked to one guy at an open forum at Florida Atlantic University. And he came up to me and said, we all know that Jesus wasn't proclaimed God until the time of Constantine. He'd been reading the Da Vinci Code. I said, man, your facts are really off base. I said, you're reading too much Dan Brown and you're not reading a lot of history here. But that was his assumption. So it's good to know some response, or at least be able to point people in the right direction about these things, because our kids might be picking up this book and saying, Mom, what about this Dan Brown guy? He's saying, just have faith. Just believe the Bible. Mom, that's the issue. I can't trust the Bible. Where do you go from there? Some resources we need to be looking into. We need to be directing our kids rather than just kind of leaving them to the wolves of society to devour their faith. So it's very important. Okay, amen.
Next question. This might be a little tough. if God is all good and all powerful, why did he make a world with so much suffering? And why doesn't he just put an end to suffering now?
All right. If God is all good and all powerful, why doesn't he just put an end to suffering now? Well, maybe because God is all wise, he has certain purposes that we can't discern about why he is allowing evil to reign, or at least to continue on this earth. You know, I think it's very helpful to keep in mind that as we worship a being who is maximally great, the greatest of all conceivable beings, that he is also going to be the wisest of all beings. And even if we don't know what the specific reason is for why evil goes on for so long, I mean, the biblical authors ask these questions. How long, O Lord? Well, this is something that we also need to remember, that God, in his wisdom, permits things, and we don't have to know the answers to that, but we can trust in a God who is one willing to step into this world, get his feet dirty and his hands bloody, and to identify this world in its suffering and pain in the person of Jesus Christ. That God is willing to go to these depths to show us how great his love is, so that even though there is great suffering in the world, we have a God who identifies with us in this suffering, rather than just saying, kind of sitting on his deck chair, so to speak, sipping his lemonade. I know I'm using unbiblical language here, but a God who is aloof from our sufferings. No, God enters into our sufferings. And so God is not, and we also read about, in 2 Peter 3:9, that God delays so that as many people as possible can be saved. So this is also part of God's plan, that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all come to repentance.
I think to piggyback on the previous question here, we got someone asking, why would a loving God send people to hell? How do you explain that? You've touched on that a bit. But
All right. Why would a loving God send people to hell? Well, remember, Matthew's gospel says that hell is prepared for the devil and his angels, that this is not something that God desires for human beings, but it is because human beings, C.S. Lewis, I think his book, The Great Divorce, is a marvelous allegory that puts in a sense, the theology of hell into proper perspective. He said that the door of hell, Nazarovia, the door of hell is closed from the inside. He said human beings in hell are successful rebels to the end. C.S. Lewis said, in the end, there are two kinds of people: those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. So it's not God sending people to hell. It's people saying no to God, and in the end they get their divorce from God, that they finally have their separation from God. And this is not because God desires it, but people like Satan in Paradise Lost, who says, better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. That's the kind of picture that we're talking about here. So it's a refusal to acknowledge God as Lord, a refusal to repent. And when people refuse to repent, how can God forgive?
got another one here asking, what if I want to believe but still have doubts?
Join the club. Now, I don't know what the level of want to believe means. You can have doubts, but still have you can still be committed to someone. Like, for example, a guy may be happily married to a woman, and he might think, what if somehow something happens down the road, and there's just not a guarantee that he just starts to wonder, and he has questions. But of course, there is no basis for it, and he may just have those questions. Does that mean that he gives up on his relationship with his wife, that he can't continue in a committed relationship with her and trusting her and so forth? He might have those questions that come up, but not good grounds for saying, I'm going to trash it all, or I'm going to get rid of this. Also, doubts come up for different reasons, as I said. Sometimes doubts come because people make bad, immoral choices, and then all of a sudden doubts start to spring up in their minds. They start living with someone, and gosh, they all of a sudden have all these doubts in their minds. Well, not surprising. Secondly, some people may just have certain emotional insecurities about their belief, and no matter how good a reasoning you do with them, no matter what evidence you give to them, they'll say, but it still could be logically possible that this is wrong. There's something deeper going on. There's some sort of an emotional issue here that can't be resolved by mere intellectual answers. And so there may be some other issues to work through with the person, rather than simply saying, oh yeah, you just need more answers apologetically. Now, there are intellectual answers that can be given to people who are struggling with intellectual challenges, and we work with them. We try to encourage them. Also, sometimes community is going to be very important. That if you're struggling and doubting, that's not the time to say, I'm just going to stay home from church. No, you need the church more than ever. You need that kind of community. You're going off to college, join an intervarsity group on campus. Join a campus crusade group. It's important for you to have fellowship, to have accountability, to have your faith encouraged and reinforced rather than just being a lone ranger. And you know what? Your faith will shrivel away. You can't survive as a lone ranger Christian. So those are a few thoughts on the issue of doubt. They all come to us. We have them in various forms. It's good to see what is the source of my doubt. And if I can work through those doubts, I ought to do that. If it's a matter of intellectually reinforcing those questions and filling in the gaps in my mind. We're getting a little bit of an exodus here. I don't know, we should keep going here. I don't know if there are any more questions, but I want to...
Yeah, one person writes, can you please address God's position on hardening Pharaoh's heart? It seems like it was not Pharaoh's fault for not letting Israel go, and yet he still was at fault.
Yeah. Two things. Well, actually, no, let me say this. God's hardening of someone's heart is phase 2 of someone's already hardening his own heart. Read the book of Jeremiah, and God lets people go or gives them over to the hardness of their hearts, or God hardens their hearts because these people have already hardened theirs against God. And so it's part 2 in this sequence. And so you'll see God saying that earlier on Pharaoh's hardening his heart, and then God is toward the end he's hardening Pharaoh's heart. And what does hardening Pharaoh's heart mean? He's simply letting him go, kind of like Romans chapter 1. He's giving them over to their desires and so forth. They've already made up their minds, and so God's saying, okay, I'm going to withdraw my influence and kind of let you have your way. That's how it operates. Read the book of Jeremiah, from beginning to end, and you'll see over and over again that God is exasperated with his people. And so he hardens their hearts because they've already resisted him. All right.
So maybe one last question.
One last question, okay.
Person writes, would you say wisdom is the knowledge of God or understanding? And he quotes from Proverbs.
Chapter 1.
The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So gaining wisdom equals understanding God and his ways. And part 2 of the question is, and can non-Christians be wise?
All right, a couple of things. Wisdom and understanding, they overlap. That's kind of a parallelism. There's certain shades that are utilized in Hebrew poetry. And but basically what wisdom is a skill for right living. That's what wisdom is. Skillful living. Knowing how to apply the things that you know in everyday decisions. You're able to make good judgments. A very wise woman whom I know is my wife. She just has an uncanny sense about knowing what's going on in relationships, about just knowing how to make judgments about certain things. And she is on the money. A very wise woman. I'm blessed to be married to her. Abundantly blessed. And she, again, has the knowledge to make the right decisions at the right time in the right circumstances. So wisdom is the skill for living rightly. Now, what says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom? Does it mean that unbelievers can't be wise? Well, they can be wise to a certain extent. They can apply wisdom. I mean, just reading the book of Proverbs. There are a lot of principles that will help a person become wiser. But you know what? The core issue is if your starting point, if your anchor point is not God and a relationship with God, then this is going to throw lots of things off in your life. You will not be functioning as you were designed to function because your primary relationship is intended to be your relationship with God. We're made to relate to God and to relate to others. And some people say, I can be good without God. Well, you know what? You can be kind to other people, but you know what? You're ignoring God altogether, and that's 50% you flunked. And God is the primary relationship, that's even worse. So we are to be, if God is not in the picture, if God is not central, then we're not going to be living as we ought. And so we are going to be fools in that sense because we're ignoring the very center of reality. Amen. All right. Anyway, it's getting pretty late. You guys have been very patient. It's 11:45. But if there are any hardy souls, I'll stick around for 15 more minutes, and you can just come up to the front and we'll take whatever questions you have. But I think it's getting pretty late, so I think we'll just turn it over to the powers that be. They can dismiss you, and I'll hang around for a little bit. Thank you.
Огромное спасибо. Thank you very much.